There's a clay tablet in the British Museum that few visitors pause to examine. Catalogue number BM 78941. It sits behind glass, roughly 4,000 years old, covered in wedge-shaped markings that most people assume record some mundane administrative detail. Grain deliveries, perhaps, tax records, but the text tells a different story, describes gods who laboured until they could labour no more, gods who cried out in protest, who demanded relief from endless toil, and in response other gods created something new, not from divine will alone, but from clay and blood, a mixture of earth and essence, workers designed to bear a burden the divine could no longer carry. This tablet is part of the Atrahasis Epic, with versions dating to the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BCE. The most complete copy was discovered at Sippar and dates to the reign of Ammi-Saduqa. The story itself draws on earlier Sumerian traditions, passed down through generations before being recorded in Akkadian. When archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th century, recovering fragments from Nineveh, Sippar and other ancient cities, they couldn't have known the interpretive firestorm these texts would ignite over a century later. Because within these ancient lines, some researchers claim to have found evidence of something extraordinary. Not mythology, not allegory, but a literal account of genetic engineering, of beings from beyond this world who manipulated the very fabric of human DNA to create a slave species, a cosmic crime hidden in plain sight for 6,000 years. Tonight, as the world quiets and your thoughts begin to drift, we're going to explore what these tablets actually say. Not to prove anything, not to convince anyone, just to examine the evidence from multiple perspectives, to weigh the translations, to consider the possibilities that have fascinated millions and troubled scholars for decades. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to. Follow every word. Some nights you'll drift in and out. That's perfect. This is for wanderers, for seekers, for those who wonder whether the oldest stories ever written might contain truths we've forgotten how to see. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, fellow wanderer, a gentle like helps others find these stories in the vast digital night. I'm curious, where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks your descent into sleep? Let the ancient world emerge in the darkness. The story begins in southern Iraq, where the air still hums with heat and the sand hides the colour of time. Beneath the modern cities of Nasiriyah and Basra lie the remains of the world's first urban civilization. Sumer, the land between two rivers. When archaeologists first began excavating these sites in the mid-19th century, they expected to find simple settlements, primitive attempts at organisation. Instead, they unearthed cities, sophisticated urban centres with complex irrigation, systems, astronomical observations of stunning precision, and above all, writing. Not crude pictographs, but a fully developed script pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing that would preserve human thought for the first time in history. The British Museum alone houses over 130,000 of these clay tablets. The Louvre, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the Baghdad Museum, each holds tens of thousands more. Most record exactly what you'd expect. Commercial transactions, legal disputes, royal decrees, the bureaucratic machinery of ancient empires, but scattered among these administrative documents are texts of a very different nature. Creation myths, flood narratives, stories of gods who walked among humans and shaped the course of civilization. And it's here in these mythological accounts that the controversy begins. The mainstream academic interpretation is clear and well established. These are religious texts, cultural artifacts that reveal how ancient Mesopotamians understood their relationship with the divine. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians and Assyrians believed in a pantheon of gods who controlled natural forces, rain, wind, fertility, war. These deities, collectively known as the Anunnaki, were the principal gods of their religion, the offspring of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. The word Anunnaki itself is well documented. In Sumerian it appears as Anuna, or Danunnae, which translates most accurately as princely seed or royal blood. The electronic text. Corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by the University of Oxford, contains 22 occurrences of this term across various texts. In each instance it refers to the assembly of the great gods, the divine council that decreed the fates of humans and determined the order of the cosmos. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages with a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has spent decades studying these texts in their original languages. His assessment is unequivocal. The Anunnaki were gods in the traditional religious sense, divine beings worshipped by the Sumerians. Nothing in the cuneiform text suggests they were physical extraterrestrial beings from another planet. But in 1976, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that would change everything. The 12th Planet. It became an international bestseller, translated into more than 25 languages, selling millions of copies worldwide, and it proposed something radical. What if the Sumerian texts weren't mythology at all? What if they were history? Literal accounts of events that actually occurred, written by people who witnessed them or inherited the memories from those who did? Sitchin was born in the Soviet Union and in 1920 raised in Palestine, and educated in economics and journalism in London. He was not a trained Assyriologist or linguist by academic standards, but he studied the ancient texts intensively for 3 decades, and he claimed to have discovered something that mainstream scholars had missed or deliberately ignored. According to Sitchin's interpretation of these texts, the Anunnaki were not gods from the realm of the supernatural. They were, he proposed, flesh and blood beings from a planet he called Nibiru, which he claimed was in an elliptical orbit beyond Neptune that brings it through the inner solar system once every 600 years. In his reading, these beings came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago for what he saw as a specific material purpose. Gold. Sitchin theorized that Nibiru's atmosphere was deteriorating, and the Anunnaki needed gold particles suspended in their stratosphere to reflect heat and stabilize their world. In his framework, Earth's gold deposits made it a target for mining operations in southern Africa and ancient Mesopotamia. The lesser gods, the Igigi, were assigned this grueling labour. It's worth noting that scholars point out Sitchin never provided specific textual references from Sumerian sources for the gold mining claim. Searchers of the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature find no references to gods mining gold. The god Ea associated with wisdom is sometimes called Bel-Nimiki, which Sitchin translated as Lord of Mining, but scholars argue the more accurate translation is Lord of Wisdom. However, the Atrahasis Epic does describe a rebellion among the labouring gods. The text portrays gods who worked in what could be interpreted as mining or agricultural labour. Growing weary of their toil, they threw down their tools, set fire to their implements, and marched to the dwelling of Enlil. The text records their cry, "The labour was heavy, the distress too much." Faced with this mutiny, the gods convened a council. Enlil wanted severe punishment, but Enki, the god of wisdom and water, proposed creating a worker to relieve the gods of their burden. A being capable of labour but under divine control, the goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belet Ili, was summoned, the birth goddess, mistress of creation. The text says she agreed to fashion this new being. Here the text becomes specific in ways that invite multiple readings. A god named Wee-Ilu, described as having personality, was brought before the assembly and slain. The text states, "They slaughtered Wee-Ilu, who had personality in their assembly. Nintu mixed clay with his flesh and blood." The passage continues, "They heard the drum beat forever after. A ghost came into existence from the god's flesh, and she proclaimed it as his living sign. The ghost existed so as not to forget the slain god." From this mixture, the text says, humanity was formed. 14 pieces of clay were pinched off. 7 males, 7 females, the Lulu Amalu, the mixed ones, part divine essence, part earthly material. The stated purpose, according to the text, to bear the yoke, to assume the drudgery of the god. For Sitchin and those who follow his interpretation, these aren't poetic metaphors. In their reading, this describes genetic engineering in the only vocabulary available to ancient peoples. The blood represents DNA. The clay represents the biological material of a primitive hominid, perhaps Homo erectus, that already existed on Earth. The mixing process becomes, in this view, genetic manipulation, creating Homo sapiens as a hybrid species designed for labour. The biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Sitchin argued, preserves a distant echo of this same event. The breath of life breathed into Adam becomes the insertion of modified genetic material. The garden itself transforms into a genetic facility. The knowledge offered by the serpent represents scientific understanding that would make humans equal to their creators. This interpretation has been embraced by millions worldwide. It offers answers to persistent questions that mainstream science struggles to explain satisfactorily. Why did Homo sapiens emerge so suddenly in the archaeological record? With cognitive abilities far beyond any other hominid, why do all modern humans, regardless of race, trace their mitochondrial DNA back to a relatively recent common ancestor in Africa? Why do ancient cultures across the globe share similar flood myths and stories of gods descending from the sky? But mainstream scholars reject Sitchin's interpretation entirely, not just as speculative but as fundamentally flawed at the level of translation and linguistic analysis. Dr. Michael Heiser created the website sitchiniswrong.com specifically to address what he considers dangerous misinformation. Heiser holds advanced degrees in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages. He can read Sumerian, Akkadian, and Ugaritic cuneiform, and he states categorically that Sitchin's translations are not merely alternative interpretations, they are factually incorrect. The word Anunnaki does not mean those who from heaven came, as Sitchin claimed. Ancient Mesopotamian dictionaries compiled by Akkadian scribes themselves and published since the mid-20th century define the term as princely seed or royal blood. The Mesopotamians left us their own glossaries, their own definitions of their words, and nowhere do these definitions support Sitchin's extraterrestrial interpretation. Similarly, Sitchin's claim that the Sumerians knew of 12 planets in the solar system, including Nibiru as the 12th, is unsupported by any cuneiform text. The Mesopotamians did create lists matching gods to celestial bodies. These lists exist, they have been published, and that they don't include a planet Nibiru in the way Sitchin described. The term Nibiru does appear in ancient texts, most notably in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. But in context, Nibiru refers to a celestial crossing point, a position in the sky, not a physical planet on a 3,600-year orbit. Most scholars identify it as another name for Jupiter, which the Babylonians associated with their chief god Marduk. As for the creation of humanity described in the Atrahasis Epic, mainstream scholars read it very differently. Yes, the text says humans were created to relieve the gods of labour. But this is understood as a theological statement about humanity's purpose to serve the divine through worship and sacrifice. The mixing of clay and divine essence is metaphorical language describing the dual nature of human existence, earthly yet bearing a divine spark of consciousness. The god Wielu, whose blood is used, represents vitality, life force, the animating principle. This is common motif in ancient Near Eastern literature, where blood equals life. The biblical prohibition against consuming blood stems from this same concept. When the text says humans were made to assume the drudgery of the god, scholars interpret this as explaining why humans must work to survive. It's an etiology, a story that explains present reality by describing primordial events. Why must we toil in fields and labour for food? Because the gods designed us that way. It's a religious answer to an existential question, not a technical manual for genetic manipulation. The flood narrative that appears in Atrahasis and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh is understood by scholars as a cultural memory of actual catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia. Geological evidence confirms that the region experienced massive floods, particularly around 2900 BCE. A layer of riverine sediment several meters thick has been found at archaeological sites including Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak, interrupting the continuity of habitation. For ancient peoples living in the flat river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, such floods would indeed seem world-ending. The entire visible world drowned. And so the story entered cultural memory, eventually being shaped into the religious narratives we now possess. But for those who follow Sitchin's interpretation, these scholarly explanations are themselves the cover-up. Mainstream academia, they argue, is either too rigid in its thinking to consider alternative possibilities, or it's actively complicit in hiding the truth. Some theorists go further, suggesting that Sitchin himself may have been part of a deliberate disclosure program. The timing of his first book in 1976 coincides with increased government interest in UFO phenomena and ancient astronautism. Theories: was Sitchin an independent researcher who stumbled upon hidden truths, or was he chosen to slowly release carefully curated information to the public, preparing humanity for eventual contact or revelation? This conspiracy angle adds another layer to the mystery. If powerful institutions know the truth about human origins, about genetic manipulation by extraterrestrial beings, about ancient advanced civilizations, then revealing this information prematurely could cause social collapse. Religion would be undermined. Political structures based on divine right or spiritual authority would crumble. The entire framework of human civilization might unravel. So perhaps, the theory goes, the truth is being released gradually through figures like Sitchin, framed as fringe speculation that can be officially denied, while slowly acclimatizing the public to concepts that will eventually be confirmed. Or perhaps Sitchin simply made mistakes. Perhaps his training in economics, journalism, his lack of formal education in ancient languages, led him to misunderstand grammatical structures and mistranslate key terms. Perhaps his genuine fascination with UFO phenomena and ancient mysteries caused him to see patterns that weren't there, to impose modern technological concepts onto ancient religious texts. The academic community certainly believes this is the case. Multiple scholars with doctorates in Assyriology and Sumerian linguistics have published detailed critiques of Sitchin's work. They point out that he frequently quoted ancient texts out of context, truncated passages to change their meaning, and assigned unconventional definitions to words without justification from Mesopotamian lexicons. Dr. Ronald Fritzer, author of Invented Knowledge, False History, Fake Science, and Pseudo-Religions, notes that when critics check Sitchin's references, they consistently find distortions. Evidence is presented selectively. Contradictory information is ignored. Their methodology, Fritzi argues, is fundamentally flawed, and yet millions of readers find Sitchin's narrative more compelling than academic orthodoxy. Why? Perhaps because the official story leaves questions unanswered. Perhaps because mainstream science sometimes seems too quick to dismiss possibilities that challenge established paradigms. Perhaps because the idea that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that our creators might return addresses something deep in human consciousness that dry academic analysis cannot satisfy. If you're still listening, still drifting between sleep and wakefulness, let me take you deeper into the texts themselves. Let's examine what the clay tablets actually say, setting aside both Sitchin's interpretation and scholarly dismissals, looking at the words as they were written 5,000 years ago. The Atrahasis Epic exists in multiple versions. The most complete is preserved on 3 tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BCE, but the story itself is older, drawing on Sumerian traditions that reach back to the 3rd millennium BCE. The text opens not with human creation, but with divine organization. After the universe was separated into heaven, earth, and the freshwater deep, lots were cast among the great gods to determine who would rule each realm. Anu received the heavens, Enlil received the earth, and Enki received the Apsu, the underground waters, but this divine order required maintenance. The canals needed to be dug, the rivers needed to be dredged. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian civilization possible required constant labour, and this work fell to the lesser gods, the Agigi. For 40 years, the text says, they laboured, day and night, digging, carrying, building, until finally they could bear it no more. The labour was heavy, the distress too much, the tablet records. They gathered in the night and marched to Enlil's dwelling, carrying torches ready for confrontation. They threw down their tools and declared they would work no more. Enlil summoned the great gods to council. He was furious at this rebellion and wanted to identify the ringleaders for punishment. But Enki counselled differently. The complaint, he argued, was just. The labour was indeed too heavy. They needed a solution, not punishment. And so Enki proposed the creation of humans. The goddess Nintu was called before the assembly. The text records the exchange. Nintu made ready to speak and said to the great gods, "It is not my task alone, but Enki's also. He cleanses all. Let him provide me with clay, then I will do the making." Enki agreed. But the process required more than clay. Wi'ilu, one of the Agigi gods, was brought forward. The text states he was chosen because he had personality. He was slain before the assembly. His blood was mixed with the clay. The passage that follows has been endlessly debated. They slaughtered Wi'ilu, who had personality, in their assembly. Nintu mixed clay with his flesh and blood. They heard the drumbeat forever after. A ghost came into existence from the god's flesh, and she proclaimed it as his living sign. The ghost existed so as not to forget the slain god. This ghost or spirit became part of human nature. Humanity would forever carry an echo of the divine. A restlessness, a memory of having been something more. The drumbeat represents the heartbeat, the life force inherited from the sacrificed god. 14 pieces of clay were pinched off, 7 were shaped into males, 7 into females. These were the first humans, the Lulu, the mixed ones. They were placed in the wombs of birth goddesses to gestate, then brought forth and set to work. The tablets describe what happened next. Humans multiplied rapidly. They spread across the land, building cities, clearing fields. But as their numbers grew, so did their noise. Their celebrations, their conflicts, their constant activity disturbed the gods. Enlil, attempting to sleep in his temple, was kept awake by the clamour of humanity. 3 times, the text says, he attempted to reduce their numbers, first through plague, then through drought, then through famine. Each time Enki intervened, teaching humans how to pray to specific gods who could avert these disasters. Finally, Enlil decided on a permanent solution. He would send a great flood, a deluge that would wipe out humanity completely. He made the other gods swear an oath not to warn humans of what was coming. But Enki found a way around his oath. He spoke to a reed wall in the house of his faithful worshipper Atrahasis, knowing the man was listening on the other side. "Well, listen to me," Enki said. "Tear down your house and build a boat. Forsake possessions and save life." Atrahasis followed these instructions. He built a vessel, sealed it with bitumen, and brought aboard his family, various craftsmen and animals. When the flood came, it lasted 7 days and 7 nights. The text describes the terror of the gods themselves, who retreated to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs as they watched the destruction below. When the waters receded, Atrahasis emerged and offered sacrifice. The gods, who had been deprived of human offerings during the flood, gathered around the sacrifice like flies, starving and desperate. They realized they needed humans after all, but the noise problem remained. So Enki proposed a new arrangement. From this point forward, not all women would bear children successfully. Some would be barren. Some pregnancies would end in miscarriage. Some infants would die. Certain classes of priestesses would be celibate. Through these mechanisms, human population would be naturally limited, and the noise would never again grow overwhelming. This is where the tablet ends, with humanity continuing but under new conditions: mortality, infant death, infertility. All these became part of human existence as a divine population control measure. Now, if you're following mainstream scholarship, you read this as sophisticated religious philosophy. The Babylonians are grappling with real problems: infant mortality, infertility, the randomness of death, and explaining them through mythological narrative. It's not history, it's theology. But if you follow Sitchin's interpretation, you read this very differently. The noise that disturbed the gods represents human advancement, technology, possibly even spiritual awakening. The Anunnaki realized their created species was becoming too intelligent, too numerous, too difficult to control. The flood was an attempted genocide, a way to start over or eliminate the problem entirely. Enki, portrayed throughout these texts as humanity's protector, saved a remnant. But the price of survival was accepting new limitations, shorter lifespans, higher infant mortality, a genetic throttling that would prevent humans from ever again reaching their full potential. The ghost or spirit inserted into humanity from Weirlu's flesh becomes, in this reading, the Anunnaki DNA itself, the genetic material that makes humans partially divine, but also forever enslaved to a nature designed by their creators. This interpretation raises profound questions about free will, about the nature of consciousness, about whether human history has been shaped by our own choices or by genetic programming installed 450,000 years ago. It's a disturbing vision, and it resonates with contemporary anxieties about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, transhumanism. Are we on the verge of doing to some new species what the Anunnaki allegedly did? To us, let me pull you back for a moment, back to the museum, to the physical reality of these tablets. The clay is real, the cuneiform markings are real, these objects exist. They were created by actual human beings living in ancient Mesopotamia who believed something about the origins of their world and their place in it. What exactly they believed, what exactly they were trying to communicate, that remains open to interpretation. The same words can be read as literal history or as metaphorical theology, depending on your starting assumptions. The academic consensus is clear. These are religious texts from polytheistic cultures that understood causation and natural phenomena very differently than we do. To read them as technical documents about genetic engineering is to impose modern concepts anachronistically onto ancient material. But the alternative view persists, growing in popularity despite scholarly rejection, that ancient peoples possessed knowledge we've lost, that their myths preserve memories of actual events, of encounters with beings whose technology seemed magical, whose capabilities seemed divine. The question becomes, which interpretation requires more faith? To believe that ancient humans invented elaborate stories about gods and creation from pure imagination? Or to believe that these stories, remarkably consistent across cultures, preserve garbled memories of real events? Both positions require leaps, both involve unprovable assumptions. What remains certain is that these tablets tell us something true about the human condition. We are labourers, we do toil for survival, we are mortal, we experience suffering, loss, limitations, and we've always wondered why. We've always searched for meaning in our existence, for explanations of our nature that go beyond mere material process. Whether the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial genetic engineers, or metaphorical representations of natural forces and divine mystery, the questions they represent remain achingly relevant. Were we designed? If so, by what or whom? Do we have a purpose beyond survival and reproduction? Is there something in human nature, some restless ghost that remembers being more than we are now? And if our creators, literal or metaphorical, were to return, what would they think of what we've become? As you drift deeper towards sleep, let's examine another controversial aspect of this narrative, the Sumerian king list, a document that claims to record every ruler of ancient Mesopotamia from the beginning of kingship. The list itself is straightforward until you reach the reigns of the earliest kings, those who ruled before the Great Flood. Alulim of Eridu, the first king ever named, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years, his successor Alalngar for 36,000 years, Enmenluana for 4,200 years. 8 kings in total ruled for a combined 241,200 years before the flood swept over the land. Then after the flood, kingship descended from heaven, once more. But now the reign lengths become more reasonable, hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. And as the list progresses toward historical periods that can be verified archaeologically, the numbers become entirely human, decades rather than centuries. Mainstream scholars explain this pattern as mythological, a common ancient Near Eastern trope, where primordial times are described in inflated numbers to convey their distance and grandeur. Similar lists exist for Egypt, where pharaohs reigned before humans, and for ancient India, where ages last millions of years. But Sitchin saw something else. He noticed that many of these impossibly long reign lengths were multiples of 3600. When divided by 3600, they became much more reasonable numbers. 28,800 becomes 8, 36,000 becomes 10, 43,200 becomes 12. What if, Sitchin proposed, these weren't Earth years but Nibiruan years? If Nibiru orbits the Sun once every 300 Earth years, and the king list was recording how many orbits each ruler reigned, then the numbers make sense. Alulim ruled for 8 Nibiruan years, which equals 28,800 Earth years. He was an Anunnaki, living by Nibiru's calendar. After the flood, kingship was transferred to human Anunnaki hybrids, who lived longer than ordinary humans but not as long as pure Anunnaki, hence the intermediate numbers. As time passed and the Anunnaki withdrew, leaving humans to govern themselves, lifespans decreased to ordinary human levels. It's an elegant solution to a genuine puzzle. The question is whether this elegance indicates truth or merely demonstrates how any sufficiently flexible interpretation can make anomalous data appear coherent. Critics point out that Sitchin cherry-picked which numbers to divide by 300. Not all the reign lengths are multiples of it. And the assumption that the Sumerians would use Nibiruan calendar years rather than their own requires believing they were recording the affairs of extraterrestrial rulers, which is exactly what the theory sets out to prove. It's circular reasoning. Moreover, the flood itself, described in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh and other texts, is presented as a unique catastrophic event, not one of many periodic disasters that would occur every 300 years if Nibiru regularly passed through the inner solar system. Astronomers have weighed in as well. A planet with the orbit Sitchin described would be gravitationally unstable. Its orbit would decay over time, either being ejected from the solar system or crashing into the sun. It couldn't maintain a 300-year elliptical orbit for hundreds of thousands of years. NASA has explicitly stated that no evidence exists for such a planet searches for unknown planetary bodies in the outer solar system have continued, prompted by gravitational anomalies in the orbits of distant objects. These searches have led to legitimate proposals for a possible Planet 9, perhaps 10 times Earth's mass, orbiting far beyond Neptune. But this hypothetical planet would have an orbital period of 10,000 to 20,000 years, not 300, and there's no evidence it ever approaches the inner solar system. Still, the fact that professional astronomers are seriously discussing the possibility of an undiscovered large planet in our own solar system gives some credence to the idea that we don't know everything about the cosmic neighbourhood. Perhaps Sitchin was right about the existence of such a planet, even if wrong about its orbit and inhabitants. The debate continues to evolve. Each side claims the evidence supports their interpretation. Each accuses the other of bias, closed-mindedness, or deliberate deception. What both sides agree on is that the ancient Mesopotamians were far more sophisticated than we once assumed. Their mathematical systems, based on 60 rather than 10, were elegant and precise. They could predict eclipses. They tracked the movements of Venus and Mars with remarkable accuracy. They understood that the year was approximately 365.25 days long and developed a calendar to account for this. How did they achieve this level of knowledge so early in human history? The mainstream answer is gradual accumulation through careful observation over generations. The alternative answer is that they were taught by the Anunnaki, who possessed advanced astronomical knowledge from their own spacefaring civilization. Both answers acknowledge the sophistication. They differ only on the source. Let's shift now to examine what the biblical text might reveal about this narrative, because the parallels are striking and have been noted by scholars regardless of their position on the Anunnaki question. Genesis chapter 6 contains one of the most enigmatic passages in the Bible. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old men of renown. This brief passage has generated centuries of theological debate. Who were the Nephilim? Who were the sons of God? Traditional Jewish and Christian interpretation has varied. Some scholars argue the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men were the descendants of Cain. The Nephilim were the offspring, giants or mighty warriors, but entirely human. Other ancient interpreters, including the Book of Enoch, which was widely read in the Second Temple period, took the passage more literally. The sons of God were angels who rebelled against divine prohibition and took human women as wives. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were hybrids, part divine, part human, and their existence was one reason God sent the flood to cleanse the earth. For Sitchin, and those who follow his interpretation, this passage describes exactly what the Sumerian texts describe. The sons of God are the Anunnaki. The daughters of men are human women. The Nephilim are the hybrid offspring, products of genetic mixing between extraterrestrial and human DNA. The Hebrew word Nephilim itself has uncertain etymology. Some derive it from the root meaning to fall, suggesting fallen ones or those who came down, which could be read as descending from the sky. Sitchin translated it as those who came down from the heavens, directly connecting it to his extraterrestrial interpretation of the Anunnaki. But Hebrew scholars, including Dr. Heiser, argue that this translation is grammatically impossible. The word structure doesn't support that reading. More likely, they argue, Nephilim derives from a root meaning giant, or perhaps warrior, describing the offspring themselves rather than their fathers. The Genesis account continues with God's response to this situation. My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. This limitation on human lifespan, whether meant as an individual limit or a warning of the time remaining before the flood, mirrors the population control measures described at the end of Atrahasis. Human mortality is divinely imposed, whether as punishment for corruption or as necessary regulation of numbers. The flood narrative that follows in Genesis bears remarkable similarity to the Mesopotamian accounts. Noah, like Atrahasis, is warned by God to build an ark. The dimensions given in Genesis are slightly different but proportionally similar to those in Gilgamesh. Both accounts describe a deluge that destroys all flesh except those saved in the vessel. Both end with sacrifice offered to God or gods who respond with promises never to send such destruction again. These parallels have been known to scholarship for over a century. The standard explanation is that the Hebrews, during their Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, encountered Mesopotamian creation and flood narratives. These stories influenced the composition of Genesis, but the Hebrews transformed the polytheistic myths into monotheistic theology, replacing the squabbling gods with a single sovereign god, eliminating the magical elements and adding ethical and spiritual depth. This is called cultural diffusion, the natural process by which stories and ideas spread between neighbouring civilizations. It's well documented throughout history and requires no conspiracy to explain. But the alternative view sees something else. Perhaps both the Sumerian and Hebrew accounts preserve memories of the same actual events. The Sumerians, closer in time and place to these events, retained more technical details, more names of individuals, more specifics about genetic manipulation. The Hebrews, recording the stories later, and from a more distant theological perspective, focused on moral and spiritual lessons rather than technical processes. In this reading, Genesis is not a later copy of Mesopotamian myth, but an independent witness to the same historical reality. The differences between the accounts reflect different perspectives on the same truth, not one culture copying another's fiction. This interpretation allows believers in both biblical authority and ancient astronaut theory to harmonize what might seem like contradictory positions. Yes, the Bible is true. Yes, God created humanity. But God, in this framework, is another name for the Anunnaki or perhaps their leader. The creation account is simplified for a less technologically sophisticated audience, but it describes the same genetic engineering event recorded in Atrahasis. Mainstream theology, both Jewish and Christian, rejects this interpretation entirely. God is not an extraterrestrial genetic engineer. The creation of humanity is not a biological process, but a spiritual and metaphysical act. To reduce divine creation to physical manipulation of DNA is to completely misunderstand the nature of both God and creation. Still, the questions linger. Why do these accounts from different cultures share such specific details? Why does the Bible preserve stories of giants, of divine human, hybrids, of a catastrophic flood if these are pure invention? The answers vary depending on who's providing them, but the questions themselves remain valid, pointing to something in human memory, whether historical or archetypal, that finds expression across cultures and millennia. As you sink deeper into rest, let me take you to one more aspect of this mystery, perhaps the most unsettling if you follow it to its conclusion. If the Anunnaki did create humanity as a slave species 450,000 years ago, if they did manipulate our DNA to ensure our obedience and limit our potential, then what happened to them? Where did they go? And more importantly, are they coming back? Sitchin's timeline suggests they never entirely left. Rather, they withdrew from direct interaction with humanity, governing from a distance through human intermediaries, through priesthoods and royal bloodlines who claimed divine descent and divine right to rule. The ancient concept of kingship found across virtually every early civilization always claimed supernatural authorization. Pharaohs in Egypt were gods incarnate, kings in Mesopotamia were appointed by the gods, Chinese emperors ruled by mandate of heaven. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was the foundational principle of political order. Why would every independent civilization develop the same system if it weren't based on some shared reality? Perhaps the theory goes because these rulers genuinely were of Anunnaki bloodline, hybrids with more divine DNA than ordinary humans, placed in power by the Anunnaki themselves to manage the human population. As millennia passed and the Anunnaki identity diluted through countless generations, the royal bloodlines became more human, less connected to their extraterrestrial origins. But the principle of divine right persisted, an echo of a time when it was literally true. This interpretation extends into secret societies and occult traditions. Freemasonry, the Illuminati, various esoteric orders throughout history are seen in this framework as custodians of ancient Anunnaki knowledge, bloodline networks preserving fragments of the original genetic and technological legacy. Their symbols, rituals, and hierarchies are not invented mystery, but inherited science, garbled over time, but still carrying traces of truth. The goal of these societies, in the most extreme version of this theory, is to prepare for the return of the Anunnaki. Nibiru's 600-year orbit means it periodically re-enters the inner solar system. Various calculations place the next return sometime in this century or the next. When the Anunnaki return, the elite who have preserved their bloodlines and knowledge will be rewarded with power in the new order, while ordinary humanity faces judgment for how we've managed the planet in their absence. This is, of course, highly speculative and impossible to verify. But it demonstrates how the Anunnaki theory extends beyond ancient history into present concerns and future anxieties. It becomes a framework for understanding power, inequality, hidden knowledge, and the sense that ordinary people are not privy to the full truth about reality. The mainstream counter-argument is straightforward. Secret societies exist and have existed throughout history, but their purposes are mundane, networking, mutual aid, preservation of craft knowledge, occasionally political conspiracy at human levels. There's no evidence of extraterrestrial contact or genetic manipulation. The symbolism and rituals draw on human psychology and cultural archetypes, not alien science. As for the Anunnaki returning, they never existed as physical beings in the first place, so they can't return. Astronomical searches have found no evidence of a planet on a 3,600-year orbit. The gravitational effects of such an object passing through the inner solar system periodically would be detectable in the orbits of other planets. We see no such evidence. The cycle of civilization, rising and falling, is explained by the natural processes: ecological collapse, resource depletion, climate change, political instability. These are sufficient to account for why empires fall and new ones rise without invoking extraterrestrial intervention. Yet the unease persists, the sense that our origins are not fully explained by current theories, the feeling that powerful interests do keep certain knowledge hidden, the observation that technological civilization seems to advance in fits and starts, almost as if knowledge is periodically lost and rediscovered rather than accumulating steadily. What if the pattern is real but the explanation different? What if human civilizations do rise and fall in cycles, not because of extraterrestrial interference, but because of inherent human tendencies toward hubris, exploitation, and self-destruction? What if we keep reaching a certain level of advancement and then collapsing because we haven't solved fundamental problems of sustainability, equality, and wisdom? In this reading, the Anunnaki myth is not history but prophecy, a warning. We are in danger of doing to ourselves and our planet what the ancient texts describe the Anunnaki doing to their homeworld. We are exploiting resources unsustainably. We are creating genetic technologies we don't fully understand. We are building artificial intelligences that may surpass and replace us. Perhaps the lesson of the Anunnaki is not that they existed, but that we must avoid becoming them. We must not become the creators who build slave species, who destroy our environment, who face rebellions from our own creations because we built exploitation into their very nature. This ethical interpretation preserves the power of the myth while avoiding the scientific and historical problems with literal, extraterrestrial contact. The tablets tell a true story, not about what happened 450,000 years ago, but about what could happen if we're not careful. They're not records, but warnings. Both mainstream scholars and alternative researchers can find value in this reading, though neither may fully embrace it. It acknowledges the sophistication of ancient thought without requiring us to believe in ancient astronauts. It takes the text seriously as meaningful communication without insisting on literal genetic engineering. But before we conclude this journey through ancient texts and modern theories, there's more to explore. The archaeological evidence itself, the physical remains that survive beyond the tablets, the comparative mythology that suggests patterns larger than Mesopotamia, and the question of what all this means for us now, living in an age when we're beginning to manipulate genetics ourselves. Let's spend some time in the physical reality of ancient Sumer, not the mythology, but the archaeology, the ruins that still stand in the deserts of Iraq, the city of Eridu, mentioned in the texts as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, still exists as an archaeological site. Tel Abu Shahrain in modern Iraq. Excavations there have revealed occupation layers stretching back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest settlements in southern Mesopotamia. At the heart of Eridu stood a temple dedicated to Enki, the god of water and wisdom. But this wasn't a single structure. As archaeologists dug down through the layers, they found 18 successive temples, each built directly on top of the previous one. The earliest was a simple reed hut. The later ones were massive ziggurats of fired brick. This architectural palimpsest tells a story of continuous sacred significance. For over 3,000 years, each generation rebuilt the temple in the same location, making it larger, more elaborate, more permanent. Why? Because the texts tell us this was Enki's dwelling place. This was where the god of the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean, maintained his presence on Earth. The final temple, built during the Ur III period around 2100 BCE, was enormous. Its base measured roughly 50 by 45 metres. Its ziggurat tower rose in stages, possibly reaching a height of 30 metres or more. At the summit stood a small shrine where, according to ritual texts, the god would descend to commune with his priests. If you were to stand in these ruins today, feeling the wind carry dust across empty foundations, what would you see? Evidence of primitive religious superstition, or remnants of something more complex? The sophistication of Sumerian engineering is undeniable. Their irrigation systems were marvels of hydraulic engineering, managing water flow from the Tigris and Euphrates through hundreds of kilometres of canals. Their cities had drainage systems, public spaces, residential districts organised by craft and trade. Their cuneiform writing system, which we've discussed primarily as a vehicle for mythology, was used for everything. Contracts, receipts, letters, legal codes, mathematical calculations, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, literature, hymns, proverbs and jokes. Yes, jokes. The Sumerians had a sense of humour preserved in clay for eternity. One tablet contains what might be the world's oldest recorded joke, something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap. Crude perhaps, but it demonstrates that these were people recognisably human in their concerns and amusements, not ancient mystics in constant contact with the divine. This humanity makes the alternative interpretations more, not less, challenging. If these were ordinary people with ordinary lives, why did they believe so strongly in the Anunnaki? Why did they spend enormous resources building temples, maintaining priesthoods, performing rituals? Was it all based on ancient memories of extraterrestrial contact? Or was it simply what humans do, creating meaning through religion and ritual? Let's examine the cylinder seals, those small carved objects that Sumerians used to mark ownership and authenticate documents. You'd roll the seal across wet clay, and it would leave an impression, a miniature scene carved in reverse on the cylinder's surface. Thousands of these seals survive. They depict gods and humans in various interactions. Often a worshipper is shown being presented to a seated deity by an intermediary god. Sometimes astronomical symbols appear, crescents representing the moon god Nana, discs representing the sun god Utu, 8-pointed stars representing Inanna. One famous seal, VA 243 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, has become central to the ancient astronaut debate. Sitchin argued that this seal depicts the solar system with 12 bodies, the Sun, the Moon, the 9 known planets, and Nibiru. He claimed the large starburst in the centre represents the Sun, and the surrounding dots are planets. But scholars who specialise in Mesopotamian iconography point out several problems with this interpretation. First, the symbol doesn't match how the Sun was consistently depicted across hundreds of artefacts. The Sumerian sun symbol featured a circle with 4 wavy lines inside a larger circle. The symbol on VA 243 is a 6-pointed star with no wavy lines, the standard iconography for a star or deity throughout Mesopotamian art. Second, ancient Mesopotamian astronomical texts never describe more than 5 planets. Dr. Michael Heiser's analysis of the cuneiform astronomical texts shows the Mesopotamians knew of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, the planets visible to the naked eye, plus the Sun and Moon. No text mentions 12 planetary bodies or anything beyond Saturn. Third, the term Nibiru does appear in Mesopotamian texts, but refers to Jupiter when it crosses the celestial equator during certain parts of its cycle. It meant crossing point, not a hidden planet. Beyond Pluto, the cuneiform inscription on VA 243 itself, which has been fully translated, discusses administrative matters and makes no reference to astronomy. Most scholars interpret the scene on VA 243 as showing a worshipper being presented to a seated deity, with the starburst being a star cluster, probably the Pleiades, which held ritual significance in Mesopotamian religion. The surrounding dots represent various celestial bodies and symbols, arranged for aesthetic and religious, rather than astronomical purposes. But this interpretation doesn't entirely settle the matter. because the Mesopotamians did have remarkable astronomical knowledge. They could predict lunar and solar eclipses with reasonable accuracy. They tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius and other stars to mark the calendar. They identified Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, and associated each with specific gods. The Multot APIN tablets, astronomical compendias, from around 1000 BCE contain extensive star catalogues and information about planetary movements. These texts represent accumulated knowledge from centuries of observation. They demonstrate that Mesopotamian astronomer priests were engaged in genuine science, recording data, identifying patterns, making predictions. How much they knew about the structure of the solar system remains debated. They certainly didn't have our modern understanding of heliocentric orbits and gravitational dynamics, but they understood more than we often credit them with. And the question remains, where did this knowledge originate? Careful observation over generations, or teaching from a more advanced source? Let's examine now a different kind of evidence. The comparative mythology that extends far beyond Mesopotamia. The story of a great flood that nearly destroys humanity appears in cultures worldwide. The biblical Noah, the Mesopotamian Atrahasis and Utnapishtim, the Hindu Manu, the Greek Deucalion, these Chinese Gun Yu, the Aztec Tantar and Nana, indigenous Australian stories of great waters covering the land. Dozens of independent traditions, all describing the same basic narrative. Mainstream scholarship explains this through a combination of factors. First, many cultures developed near rivers or coasts where flooding was a real danger, so flood stories naturally emerge. Second, at the end of the last ice age, around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, global sea levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted, flooding coastal areas and river valleys worldwide. This catastrophic event may have left traces in human cultural memory, passed down through oral tradition until eventually recorded in various mythologies. But alternative researchers ask, if these stories emerge independently from each culture's experience with local floods, why do they share such specific details? A divine warning to one faithful person, instructions to build a vessel, the preservation of animals, the sending of birds, to search for dry land, the offering of sacrifice after emerging, the divine promise never to flood the earth again. These specific parallels suggest either cultural diffusion, the stories spread from a common source as human populations migrated, or a common historical event, remembered independently by different descendant populations. The creation myths show similar patterns. Many cultures describe humanity being formed from clay or earth by divine beings. The Mesopotamian tradition we've examined, the biblical account in Genesis, the Egyptian god Khnum shaping humans on a potter's wheel, the Greek Prometheus modelling humans from clay, the Maori god Tani creating the first woman from earth. Chinese, Aztec and numerous other traditions contain similar elements. Why clay specifically? The scholarly answer points to agricultural societies observing that life emerges from soil. Plants grow from earth. Thus, by analogy, humans too must originate from earth. Clay is particularly significant because it can be shaped, holding its form when dried, making it a natural metaphor for divine creation. The alternative answer suggests these traditions remember actual genetic engineering processes where early humans or proto-humans were manipulated, and clay, or earth, was the term ancient peoples used for biological material they didn't have vocabulary to describe more precisely. Consider also the recurring theme of divine-human hybrids. The Nephilim in Genesis, Greek demigods, offspring of gods and mortal women, Hindu avatars incarnating in human form, the pharaohs of Egypt claiming divine parentage, Polynesian chiefs tracing their genealogies to gods, the tendency of royal bloodlines worldwide to claim divine descent. Is this merely political propaganda, kings asserting legitimacy through invented divine connections, or does it preserve memory of actual genetic intermixing between two populations, one more advanced than the other, with the ruling classes being the hybrid offspring? The archaeological record complicates these questions in interesting ways. Human evolution shows a remarkably rapid development of cognitive abilities. Homo sapiens emerges in Africa around 300,000 years ago, but for most of that time shows relatively simple tool use and cultural behaviour. Then, approximately 50,000 years ago, there's an explosion of innovation. Complex tools, cave art, ceremonial burials, trade networks, symbolic thinking. What caused this great leap forward, as it's sometimes called? Genetic mutation affecting brain structure? Reaching a critical threshold of brain size? Or, as alternative theories suggest, genetic intervention by the Anunnaki or their equivalents? Recent discoveries in genetics add another layer. Studies of ancient DNA have revealed that Homo sapiens interbred with at least 2 other hominid species, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Modern humans outside Africa carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some Asian populations carry trace amounts of Denisovan DNA. This mixing occurred between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago, so we know for certain that human evolution involved genetic mixing between different hominid populations. The question is whether those populations were all naturally evolved Earth species, or whether one population had extraterrestrial origins. Mainstream paleontology sees no evidence for extraterrestrial involvement. The fossil record, while incomplete, shows a clear evolutionary progression from earlier primates to modern humans. Each intermediate form can be understood as adaptation to environmental pressures and ecological niches. No sudden appearance of fully formed modern humans requiring outside intervention. But critics of conventional timelines point to anomalies: the rapid development of certain cognitive abilities, the relatively small genetic differences between humans and other great apes, 98.8% genetic similarity with chimpanzees, yet enormous cognitive differences, the unique aspects of human anatomy, large brains relative to body size, reduced body hair, extended childhood development, that don't always have clear adaptive explanations. These could be evidence of genetic manipulation, or they could simply be the result of evolution through natural selection in specific environmental and social contexts. The debate continues, with neither side able to provide conclusive proof. Let me guide you now toward contemporary implications. If we grant, even hypothetically, that the Anunnaki narrative contains truth, what does it mean for us today? We live in an age of revolutionary genetic technology. CRISPR gene editing allows precise modification of DNA. In vitro fertilization enables reproduction outside the womb. Cloning has been achieved in various species. Synthetic biology aims to create entirely new organisms designed for specific purposes. We are, in short, developing the capability to do what the Anunnaki allegedly did: to create new species or modify existing ones for our purposes. We are becoming the Anunnaki. This raises profound ethical questions. If we create genetically modified humans, what responsibilities do we have toward them? If we design organisms to serve specific functions, what are their rights? If we succeed in creating artificial intelligence that achieves consciousness, what moral status does it have? The Anunnaki narrative provides a cautionary tale. If they created humans as slaves and then faced rebellion, it suggests that created beings inevitably develop autonomy and resist their programming. If this is true, then any species we create will eventually do the same to us. Perhaps this is the real value of the ancient texts, not as historical documents, but as ethical warnings. They pose questions we must answer before we develop technologies that make those questions urgent. Consider the issue of human enhancement through genetic modification. If we could edit human embryos to increase intelligence, eliminate disease susceptibility, or extend lifespan, should we? Who gets access to such enhancements? If only the wealthy can afford genetic optimization, do we create a biological caste system, genetically superior elites and unmodified masses, that mirrors the Anunnaki-human relationship described in the tablets? These aren't hypothetical concerns. They're active debates in bioethics, genetic counselling, and international policy. China has already reported the first genetically modified human babies with edited genes for HIV resistance. The technology exists. The question is how we use it. The Anunnaki narrative suggests one possible future: a world where one group, whether extraterrestrial or simply more technologically advanced humans, creates another group as servants, tools, property. And it shows how that relationship inevitably breaks down when the created beings develop consciousness and agency. If we want to avoid that future, we need to think carefully about the ethics of creation itself. What makes a being worthy of moral consideration? Is it genetics, consciousness, the capacity for suffering, or something else? And what responsibilities does a creator have toward their creation? These questions are ancient, present in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Greek tragedies about hubris, in the story of Frankenstein's monster, but they're increasingly urgent as technology gives us powers that once belonged only to gods or, if you prefer, to the Anunnaki. There's another contemporary dimension worth examining. The Anunnaki theory has become intertwined with modern conspiracy thinking in ways that are sometimes productive and sometimes deeply problematic. On one level, the theory encourages questioning of authority and official narratives. It suggests that academic institutions, governments, and religious organizations may not be telling the full truth about human origins. This skepticism can be healthy, prompting critical examination of assumptions and asking for evidence. But it can also slide into unfalsifiable conspiracy thinking, where any evidence against the theory is dismissed as part of the cover-up. If mainstream scholars reject the Anunnaki interpretation, that's because they are part of the suppression. If astronomical searches find no planet Nibiru, that's because the discovery has been classified. This kind of thinking makes it impossible to determine what's actually true, since all evidence can be interpreted to support the preferred conclusion. Moreover, some versions of the ancient astronaut theory have been appropriated by racist and supremacist ideologies. The suggestion that ancient non-European civilizations couldn't have achieved their accomplishments without extraterrestrial help implicitly denies the capabilities of those cultures. This is a real problem that responsible researchers in this field work to counteract. It's possible to explore alternative interpretations of ancient texts without denigrating the civilizations that produced them. The Sumerians were brilliant, whether or not they had contact with extraterrestrials. Their achievements in mathematics, astronomy, law, literature, and urban planning represent genuine human ingenuity. Acknowledging the possibility of outside influence shouldn't diminish respect for their contributions. Let's examine one more dimension of this mystery before we bring our journey to a close: the religious and spiritual implications. For believers in traditional monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Anunnaki theory presents challenges. If the Genesis creation account is a simplified version of Sumerian genetic engineering stories, what happens to doctrines about the soul, original sin, redemption, and divine nature? Some theologians and believers have attempted synthesis. Perhaps God worked through natural processes, including extraterrestrial intervention, to create humanity. Perhaps the Anunnaki were angels, or their equivalent in God's plan. Perhaps the spiritual dimension of creation remains true even if the physical mechanism involved genetic engineering. Others firmly reject any compatibility. The biblical account is not myth or allegory, but truth revealed by God. Humans are created in God's image, not genetically engineered by aliens. The soul is breathed by God, not a byproduct of Anunnaki DNA. The two narratives are fundamentally incompatible for those who don't hold traditional religious beliefs. The Anunnaki theory can provide an alternative framework for spirituality. Perhaps we are connected to the cosmos in a literal way, carrying genetic material from beings whose origins lie in the stars. Perhaps our destiny is to eventually join the cosmic community, to become spacefaring ourselves and perhaps create our own successor species. This cosmic perspective can be either humbling or empowering. Humbling because it suggests we're not special, just one more creation in a universe full of intelligent life. Empowering because it suggests we have potential we haven't realized, that our creator's capabilities might be latent in our genes, waiting to be activated. Various New Age and esoteric spiritual movements have incorporated elements of ancient astronaut theory into their worldviews. The idea of starseeds, humans who carry alien DNA and have incarnated on Earth to help with humanity's evolution. The concept of ascension, where humans will eventually transcend physical limitations and join higher dimensional beings. The belief in cosmic consciousness, or a galactic federation waiting for humanity to mature enough to join. These spiritual frameworks serve similar functions to traditional religions, providing meaning, purpose, hope, and answers to existential questions. Whether they're true in any objective sense remains impossible to determine, but they demonstrate the enduring human need to understand our place in the cosmos, and to feel connected to something larger than ourselves. The question then becomes not so much whether the Anunnaki were real, but what function the belief serves. What does it provide that scientific materialism or traditional religion doesn't? For many believers, it offers a third way between the perceived coldness of science that reduces us to products of random mutation and the perceived dogmatism of religion that requires faith in unprovable claims. The Anunnaki narrative says, Yes, we were created with purpose, but by beings who themselves evolved or were created. Yes, there's something special about humanity, but it's our potential to join the cosmic community, not our status as the unique focus of divine attention. Yes, we should have ethical frameworks and spiritual practices, but based on understanding our true nature and origins, not on obedience to arbitrary commandments. This middle position appeals to people who value both scientific thinking and spiritual meaning, who want evidence-based beliefs, but also want to believe in something greater than mere matter, an energy. Whether this is a valid synthesis or an uncomfortable compromise depends on your perspective, but it undeniably fills a need for many people searching for meaning in a complex, often confusing modern world. Let me take you back one final time to the British Museum, to tablet K3657, to the clay that has somehow survived 4,000 years of time and conquest and neglect. Stand there in the quiet gallery, look at the wedge marks pressed into that ancient surface. Each mark was deliberate, created by a human hand that learned the script through years of training, that copied these particular stories because the culture valued them, that believed something profound enough to invest the labour of preservation. What that ancient scribe believed exactly we can never fully recover. The phenomenological experience of being a Babylonian, of actually living within that worldview, of experiencing the gods as present realities rather than ancient myths, that's lost to us forever. What remains is the clay, and our interpretation. For some readers, these tablets are evidence of the most important fact in human history, that we are not alone, that we were never alone, that our creation was an act of genetic engineering by beings from beyond this world, that everything we think we know about human origins is wrong, and the truth has been hiding in plain sight in these ancient texts that mainstream scholarship has misinterpreted or deliberately obscured. This reading demands we reconsider our entire understanding of reality. If the Anunnaki were real, then human civilization didn't develop naturally through gradual innovation. It was taught, jump-started by beings with advanced knowledge. Our religious traditions aren't human invention seeking meaning, they're distorted memories of actual contact with our creators. Our sense that something is wrong with the world, that we're somehow enslaved to systems we don't control, isn't paranoia or metaphor. It's accurate recognition of genetic programming installed hundreds of thousands of years ago. This perspective can be liberating. It says our intuitions about being more than just material beings, about having potential we haven't realized, about being connected to the cosmos. Those aren't delusions, they're memories, encoded in our DNA, of what we were meant to be before our creators limited us. Or it can be oppressive. It says we're slaves by design, that free will might be an illusion, that powerful forces have always controlled humanity and probably still do through bloodlines and secret knowledge. It can lead to fatalism, the sense that we're trapped in a system designed to keep us subordinate. The alternative reading, the mainstream scholarly interpretation, offers different truths. These are religious texts from complex ancient civilizations that developed sophisticated theological and philosophical systems to understand human existence. They're not primitive or naive, they're the work of intelligent people grappling with the same questions we still face. Why do we exist? Why must we work and suffer? Why are we mortal? What's our relationship with forces greater than ourselves? The Mesopotamians answered these questions through mythology that made sense within their worldview, that served social functions, that provided meaning and structure for their lives. This reading preserves human agency. We created these stories, which means we can create new ones. We're not programmed or limited except by our own choices and natural constraints. Our civilization is our own achievement, not a gift from extraterrestrials. Our problems are our responsibility to solve, not the result of genetic manipulation we're powerless to overcome. This perspective can be empowering. It says we're the authors of our own story, that human creativity and ingenuity are real and remarkable. Or it can be lonely, situating us in a vast universe where we're accidents of evolution, where consciousness emerged through blind natural processes, where meaning is only what we create for ourselves in the face of an ultimately meaningless cosmos. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing one interpretation over the other, but in recognizing that both speak to genuine aspects of the human condition. We are, in a sense, created beings. Whether by extraterrestrial genetic engineers, evolutionary processes, or divine will, we didn't create ourselves. We emerge from something prior, We inherited our nature, our capacities, our limitations from processes and powers beyond our control. We do labour for survival in ways that sometimes feel like slavery, whether that's genetic programming by the Anunnaki, or simply the harsh reality of existence in a material universe with limited resources. We're constrained by needs and compulsions we didn't choose. We do have a sense of being both earthly and divine, material and spiritual, limited and transcendent. Whether that's Anunnaki DNA giving us a trace of extraterrestrial consciousness, or simply the emergence of self-awareness in a universe that's mostly unconscious, we experience ourselves as different from the rest of nature. And we do search for meaning, telling stories about our origins that try to make sense of our existence. Whether those stories preserve ancient truths or create present meaning, they serve essential human needs. The Anunnaki tablets, whatever their ultimate origin, remind us that these questions are eternal. Every generation must grapple with them anew. Every culture creates narratives that attempt to answer them. And the answers we give shape not just our understanding of the past, but our vision for the future. If we believe we're genetically limited slaves, we might focus on breaking those limitations through technology, genetic engineering, consciousness expansion, trying to overcome our programming. If we believe we're naturally evolved beings, we might focus on working with our nature, adapting to our environment, living sustainably within our biological and ecological constraints. If we believe we're divinely created souls temporarily inhabiting flesh, we might focus on spiritual development, transcending material existence, preparing for whatever comes after death. Each belief system leads to different priorities, different ethics, different futures, and perhaps that's the real significance of the Anunnaki debate, not whether they existed historically, but what we believe about them now, because those beliefs shape what we do and who we become. The clay tablets endure, patient witnesses to human searching. They'll outlast our current theories and interpretations just as they've outlasted countless previous ones. Future generations will read them through lenses we can't imagine, finding meanings we never considered. And that's appropriate. These texts weren't meant to provide final answers. They were meant to preserve questions, to keep alive the mystery of human origins and purpose, to ensure that each generation continues the ancient conversation about who we are and where we came from. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings from planet Nibiru, whether they're metaphorical representations of natural and divine forces, or whether there's something else entirely that we haven't yet imagined, the questions they raise remain vital. Were we designed? Do we have a purpose? Are we alone? What is our potential? Who or what controls our destiny? How should we live given uncertainty about our origins? These questions won't be finally answered by archaeological discovery or linguistic analysis or even by contact with extraterrestrial life if it occurs. They're existential questions that each individual and each generation must answer for themselves, based on available evidence, personal experience, and chosen values. The tablets invite us into that ongoing conversation. They are not providing information so much as provoking inquiry. They're saying, look, ancient peoples thought deeply about these matters. They created sophisticated narratives to understand themselves and their world. What narratives will you create? What will you believe about human nature and destiny? How will those beliefs shape the future you build? In this sense, the Anunnaki are less important as historical fact than as existential symbol. They represent the question of whether we're autonomous beings creating our own meaning, or whether we're part of a larger story authored by forces beyond our comprehension. Whether we were made for a purpose or must create purpose for ourselves. Whether we're limited by our nature or capable of transcending it. These aren't questions with simple answers. They're tensions we live within, pulling us in different directions, requiring us to choose even though we lack complete information. The clay tablets endure, holding space for that uncertainty, reminding us that humans have always wondered and always will. The mystery remains, the search continues, and in that continuing search, in that refusal to accept easy answers or stop asking questions, we might find something essential about what makes us human. Let me take you back one final time to the British Museum, to tablet K3657, but before we return to that starting point, let's explore one more crucial dimension, the psychology of belief itself. Why do millions of people find the Anunnaki theory compelling despite scholarly rejection? What need does it satisfy that conventional narratives don't? Psychologists who study belief formation point to several factors. First, the need for meaning and purpose. Humans are meaning-making beings. We don't just want to know what happened, we want to know why it happened and what it means for us. The standard evolutionary account of human origins, that we emerged through natural selection over millions of years as an adaptation to environmental pressures, provides mechanism but not meaning. We're here because we survived. That's it. The Anunnaki narrative, by contrast, provides purpose. We were created for a reason, albeit originally a problematic one. We have potential programmed into our DNA by beings more advanced than ourselves. Our history is part of a larger cosmic story. Even if that story includes uncomfortable elements like slavery and rebellion, it's still meaningful in a way that pure natural selection isn't. Second, there's the appeal to hidden knowledge. Humans are naturally curious, and we're drawn to the idea that there are secrets, important truths that most people don't know, but that we can discover. The Anunnaki theory positions believers as more knowledgeable than the masses who accept conventional narratives. This provides psychological satisfaction, a sense of being special, enlightened, ahead of the curve. This isn't necessarily cynical or delusional. Throughout history, many important truths were initially rejected by mainstream institutions before eventually being accepted. Heliocentrism, germ theory, continental drift, all faced resistance from established authorities. So the fact that academic consensus rejects an idea doesn't automatically mean it's wrong. Sometimes the fringe view is correct. The problem is determining which fringe views are legitimate discoveries and which are merely appealing fictions. That requires careful evaluation of evidence, methodological rigor, openness to revision when new data emerges. Both mainstream and alternative researchers sometimes fall short of these standards. Third, there's cognitive bias in interpretation. Humans are pattern-seeking beings. We're very good at finding connections and patterns, sometimes too good. Pareidolia, seeing faces in clouds, is one example. Apophenia, perceiving meaningful connections in random data, is another. Once we have a theory, confirmation bias leads us to notice evidence that supports it and overlook or explain away evidence that contradicts it. This affects both believers and skeptics. A believer in the Anunnaki theory will read the Atrahasis Epic and see genetic engineering. A skeptic will read the same text and see religious metaphor. Both are filtering the evidence through their existing frameworks. Both believe they're being objective. Both may be partly right and partly wrong. Fourth, there's the role of narrative satisfaction. Good stories have certain qualities: conflict, resolution, heroes and villains, cause and effect, meaning. The Anunnaki narrative is a compelling story. It has dramatic conflict between different factions of gods, between gods and their creations. It has clear causation, why humans exist, why we're mortal, why civilization developed. It provides villains, oppressive Anunnaki overlords, and heroes, Enki protecting humanity, humans rebelling against their programming. It's satisfying as narrative in ways that scientific accounts often aren't. This doesn't mean it's false. Truth can be narratively satisfying too, but it does mean we need to be cautious about accepting a theory because it makes a good story, rather than because evidence supports it. These psychological factors don't invalidate the Anunnaki theory, but they suggest we should examine our own motivations for believing or disbelieving carefully. Are we drawn to this interpretation because evidence genuinely supports it, or because it satisfies psychological needs that conventional narratives don't? Let's examine now some specific textual evidence that both sides cite in their arguments. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation accounts we possess, provides fascinating details often overlooked in broader discussions. This text, recovered from fragments at Nippur and dating to approximately 1600 BCE, begins with a missing section presumed to have described the original, creation of humans. When the surviving text begins, the goddess Ninta is lamenting humanity's forgotten state and planning to lead them back from their wandering. The text then describes 5 cities being founded before the flood, each given to a specific god: Eridu to Enki, Bad Tibira to Dumuzi and Inanna, Larak to a protective deity, Sipar to Utu the sun god, and Shurapak to Ansud, a grain goddess. These cities, the text says, had been given names, had been allotted baskets for measuring, and had begun dredging canals blocked with silt. Their cleaning of waterways established abundant growth. This is followed by a lacuna, a missing section, during which the antediluvian kings must have been described. When the text resumes, humans have multiplied, and their noise disturbs Enlil, who can't sleep. After attempting plague, drought, and famine, each thwarted by Enki, Enlil decides to send a flood. The hero Ziusudra, whose name means life of long days, receives a vision warning, him of the coming disaster. He builds a boat, survives 7 days and nights of deluge, and emerges to sacrifice to An and Enlil. In response, these gods give Ziusudra breath eternal immortality, and place him to dwell in Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, often identified with Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. What's fascinating about this account is its matter-of-fact tone. Cities exist. Humans are farming and maintaining canal systems. The problem is simply population pressure and noise. The solution is population reduction through disaster, then regulations to prevent the problem recurring. For mainstream scholars, this reflects real historical experience. Mesopotamian cities did struggle with resource management, overpopulation, and the consequences of human activity on the environment. The myth translates these practical concerns into theological narrative. For alternative interpreters, the emphasis on noise is significant. Noise might be a metaphor for technological development, communication systems, perhaps even radiation or electromagnetic signals that interfered with Anunnaki operations. The flood becomes not environmental disaster but deliberate population reduction of a species growing too advanced, too numerous, too threatening to their creator's control. The granting of immortality to Ziusudra parallels the biblical tradition of Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him, and Elijah, taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. These exceptional humans who achieved immortality or ascended to divine realms, do they represent genetic mutations, individuals whose Anunnaki DNA expressed more fully? Or are they simply mythological heroes whose exceptional virtue earned divine reward? Both readings are possible. Neither can be definitively proven from the text alone. Let's examine another crucial text, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic we've touched on but haven't fully explored. This text, while later than the Sumerian originals, preserves and elaborates earlier traditions. The Enuma Elish describes the creation of the universe beginning from watery chaos. Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, mingle together. From their union, the first generation of gods emerges. But as these younger gods grow noisy and active, Apsu decides to destroy them so he can rest. Ea, the god of wisdom corresponding to Sumerian Enki, discovers this plan. He recites a spell that puts Apsu into deep sleep, then kills him. Ea establishes his dwelling on Apsu's body, and there Marduk is born, the great god of Babylon. Tiamat, enraged by Apsu's death, creates an army of monsters to wage war on the younger gods. None of them are brave enough to face her except Marduk, who agrees to fight on the condition that if he wins, he'll be made supreme king of all gods. The battle is dramatic. Marduk uses the four winds, a great net, and an arrow to defeat Tiamat. He splits her body in half, using one part to create the sky and the other to create the earth. He positions celestial bodies in their proper places, organizing the cosmos. Then comes the crucial passage about human creation. The gods bring Kingu, Tiamat's consort and the leader of her army, before Ea. His blood is shed. From it, Ea creates humanity. The purpose is stated explicitly. My blood will I take and bone will I fashion. I will make man, that man may serve the gods. I will create man who shall inhabit the earth, that the service of the gods may be established and that their shrines may be built. This account differs from Atrahasis in specific details, but agrees on the central point. Humans were created from divine blood and earth specifically to serve the gods, relieving them of labour. The text concludes with the gods building Babylon and Marduk's temple Esagil as a reward for his victory. Then follows a long section listing Marduk's 50 names, each describing different aspects of his power and authority. For mainstream scholars, this text is transparent political propaganda. Babylon, seeking to justify its dominance over older Mesopotamian cities, promoted its patron god Marduk to chief of the pantheon. The earlier version of this myth likely featured Enlil or another god in Marduk's role. The theological move was straightforward. Elevate Marduk, elevate Babylon. The creation of humans from the blood of a defeated enemy god is understood as theological symbolism. Humans contain divine essence, explaining our consciousness and capacity for reason, but are made from a rebel god, explaining our tendency toward chaos and disobedience. The requirement to serve the gods justifies the temple system and priestly class, giving theological foundation to economic and social structures, but alternative interpreters read technological information between the lines. Tiamat represents a planetary body, perhaps the asteroid belt or a destroyed planet whose remnants became Earth and the Moon. Marduk represents Nibiru, entering the solar system and colliding with this earlier planet. The battle is planetary cataclysm, the cosmic violence that shaped our solar system's current configuration. The creation of humans from Kingu's blood becomes genetic engineering using DNA from a defeated rival faction. The requirement to serve suggests not religious duty, but literal slavery built into our genetic code. Sitchin went further, proposing that tablet references to Marduk having 4 eyes and 4 ears describe Nibiru having 4 moons or satellites. References to Marduk's perfect limbs describe orbital characteristics. The entire epic, he argued, is scientific cosmology encoded in mythological language. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as reading modern concepts into ancient texts. The 4 eyes and 4 ears are metaphorical descriptions of godly perfection and omniscience, standard divine attributes in ancient Near Eastern literature. Similar language appears in describing other gods and has nothing to do with planetary satellites. But the debate highlights an interesting hermeneutical question. How do we interpret ancient texts that describe events and beings beyond normal human experience? If the ancients encountered something extraordinary, whether extraterrestrial contact or natural phenomena they didn't understand, they would describe it using the vocabulary and concepts available to them. Those descriptions would necessarily be metaphorical or analogical, not technical. So the question becomes, can we recover the actual events behind the mythological language? Or has the encoding process so thoroughly transformed the information that recovering it is impossible? Consider how ancient peoples described meteorological phenomena. Thunder was gods bowling or chariot wheels in the sky. Lightning was divine weapons. Earthquakes were gods or giant creatures moving beneath the earth. These were the best explanations available given their understanding of causation and natural law. But notice, the phenomena they described were real. Thunder and lightning exist. Earthquakes happen. Their interpretations were wrong, but they were interpreting actual events, not inventing pure fiction. Could the same be true for the Anunnaki? Real beings or events misinterpreted and encoded in mythological language? Or are they pure invention, like Zeus and Thor, gods who never existed in any form outside human imagination? The answer matters not just for history, but for how we understand human consciousness and culture. Are we myth-making beings who invent stories to explain existence? Or are we memory-preserving beings who distort actual events through mythological or encoding but retain genuine information? Probably both. Different myths likely have different origins. Some are purely symbolic, teaching moral lessons or explaining natural phenomena through imagined characters and events. Others may preserve genuine historical memories distorted through time and cultural transmission. The challenge is determining which is which. Let's examine one more textual tradition before we close, the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that didn't make it into the biblical canon, but was widely read in the Second Temple period and is still considered scripture by Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. The Book of Enoch elaborates the Genesis 6 passage about the Nephilim with extraordinary detail. It names the fallen angels who descended to earth, Azazel, Semjaza, and 200 others. It describes them teaching humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, weaponry, sorcery. It explains that the Nephilim giants were their offspring with human women, and that these giants consumed all of Earth's resources and began eating humans. The flood, in this account, was sent specifically to eliminate the Nephilim and cleanse the earth of corruption. The fallen angels were imprisoned in valleys beneath the earth until final judgment. The spirits of the dead Nephilim became demons, wandering the earth seeking to possess humans. This text provides much more detail than Genesis. And interestingly, it aligns more closely with the Sumerian accounts than the biblical version does. Knowledge brought from heaven, divine beings creating hybrid offspring, population problems requiring divine intervention, imprisonment of rebel gods. Even the emphasis on teaching humans forbidden arts echoes Prometheus giving fire to humans in Greek myth. These parallels across different cultures and religious traditions suggest either cultural diffusion, the stories spread from a common origin, or archetypal patterns, humans independently generating similar, Myths because they address universal psychological and existential concerns. Or, as alternative researchers argue, the parallels exist because all these traditions preserve memories of the same actual events, recorded independently by different descendant populations with varying degrees of accuracy and theological interpretation. Enoch's account includes a fascinating astronomical component. Enoch is taken on tours of the heavens and shown the mechanisms that control celestial movements, how the sun and moon move, how the seasons change, how the stars are positioned. This astronomical knowledge frames the entire text, suggesting that heavenly knowledge and earthly corruption are intimately connected. For scholars of Second Temple Judaism, this reflects the period's interest in apocalyptic literature and cosmic dualism. For ancient astronaut theorists, it describes actual tours of the solar system or astronomical instruction by extraterrestrial beings. The text's exclusion from the biblical canon happened relatively late, and in fact the New Testament Epistle of Jude quotes 1 Enoch, suggesting early Christians accepted its authority. Its exclusion reflects later theological concerns about its elaborate angelology and potential to encourage angel worship. But its influence on early Jewish and Christian thought was enormous, shaping ideas about demons, fallen angels, the origin of evil, and the structure of heaven and hell. Whether Enoch preserves genuine ancient traditions about extraterrestrial contact or represents creative theological development in the intertestamental period, it demonstrates how the themes we've been exploring, divine-human hybrids, forbidden knowledge, cosmic rebellion, have been central to human religious thought for millennia. These aren't fringe ideas introduced by Sitchin in the 1970s. They're ancient traditions that mainstream religion has struggled with, sometimes embracing, sometimes suppressing, but never quite eliminating. The persistence of these themes suggests they address something fundamental in human consciousness, whether that's memory of actual events, archetypal psychological structures, or existential questions about our nature and origins. These stories continue to fascinate and disturb us. As we move toward conclusion, let me address the elephant in the room: the lack of physical evidence for extraterrestrial contact. If the Anunnaki came to Earth 450,000 years ago and established mining operations, genetic laboratories and cities, where's the evidence? Where are the crashed spacecraft? The advanced tools, the genetic facilities, the remnants of technology that would be unmistakably non-human? This is the strongest argument against the ancient astronaut theory. Despite decades of archaeological excavation across Mesopotamia and beyond, nothing definitively extraterrestrial has been found. No materials that couldn't have been produced with ancient human technology, no artifacts that demonstrate knowledge of physics or engineering beyond what the civilizations of the time could have achieved. Alternative researchers respond in several ways. First, 450,000 years is an immense span of time. Even very durable materials would erode, decay, or be buried beyond easy discovery. Second, if the Anunnaki left deliberately, they might have taken most of their technology with them. Third, significant evidence might exist but be classified by governments or misidentified in museum collections. Fourth, what we interpret as natural formations or mundane artifacts might actually be remnants of ancient technology we don't recognize because we're not looking for it or don't understand what we're seeing. These responses are possible but unfalsifiable. They make it impossible to disprove the theory because any lack of evidence can be explained away. This is a fundamental problem in alternative historical theories. They often can't specify what evidence would disprove them, which means they're not genuinely scientific hypotheses. Science requires falsifiability. You must be able to say, if we found X, that would prove my theory wrong. Without this, you have belief, not science. So the honest answer from the alternative perspective must be, we believe the Anunnaki theory is true based on textual interpretation and astronomical speculation, but we acknowledge we lack physical evidence that would convince skeptics. We think that evidence might exist and be misunderstood or hidden, but we can't prove it. We're making an informed interpretation of suggestive evidence, not establishing scientific fact. This more modest claim is defensible. Yes, the texts can be read this way. Yes, the reading is interesting and it addresses real questions. No, we can't prove it's correct. We offer it as a possibility worth considering, not as established truth. The problem arises when the theory is presented with absolute certainty, when believers claim to know for sure that ancient astronauts created humanity when they dismiss all counterarguments as willful blindness or conspiracy. That crosses from speculation into dogmatism. Similarly, mainstream scholars sometimes cross from justified skepticism into dogmatic dismissal, refusing to even consider alternative interpretations because they violate current paradigms. The healthiest approach is genuine openness, considering all theories that fit the evidence, being honest about what we don't know, adjusting our beliefs as new information emerges. Let me take you back one final time to the British Museum, to tablet K3657. The wedge marks pressed into that clay were made by a human hand, a scribe in ancient Babylon who learned his craft through years of training, who copied these stories because his culture valued them, who believed something about the world and wanted to preserve it for the future. What exactly that scribe believed we can never know with certainty. We can read the words, translate them to the best of our ability, analyse their grammar and vocabulary and context. But the lived reality of ancient Mesopotamian religion, the actual experience of believing in the Anunnaki, in Enlil and Enki and Nintu, that's lost to us. What remains is the clay, and our interpretation of what it means. For some, it's evidence of extraterrestrial contact, of genetic manipulation, of a cosmic drama in which humanity plays a smaller role than we imagined. We are not masters of our destiny, but products of someone else's design, carrying alien DNA in every cell, living out purposes we didn't choose. For others, it's evidence of human creativity, of our eternal search for meaning, of our need to explain suffering and mortality and the harsh realities of existence through stories that give them cosmic significance. We are not engineered slaves, but meaning-making beings, creating narratives that help us endure. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing one interpretation over the other, but in recognizing that both speak to something real about the human condition. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings or metaphorical representations of forces beyond human control, the questions they represent remain. Are we free or determined? Were we designed or did we emerge through natural processes? Do we have a purpose beyond survival? Are we alone in the universe or part of a larger cosmic community? When we reach the limits of our understanding, when science cannot yet answer our deepest questions, what stories do we tell ourselves? The Sumerian tablets offer one set of answers, science offers another. Various religious traditions offer others still. None of these answers is complete. None fully satisfies the longing for certainty that drives human inquiry. What the tablets ultimately reveal is not the nature of the Anunnaki, but the nature of humanity. We are the species that writes things down, that preserves stories across millennia, that never stops asking where we came from and where we're going. We are the beings who look at clay tablets covered in wedge marks and see either ancient astronauts or religious poetry and argue passionately about which interpretation is correct. That capacity for interpretation, for debate, for seeking meaning in ancient marks on clay, that might be the most remarkable thing about us. Whether it's the result of genetic engineering or natural evolution, it's what makes us human. Sleep well, wondering. Let the questions drift through your dreams. The tablets will still be there tomorrow, behind museum glass, holding their secrets, waiting for the next interpreter to arrive with new eyes and new theories. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Mystery preserved, questions perpetuated, the search continuing across generations, each adding their voice to the conversation that began 5,000 years ago when a scribe first pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and started to write. The story begins, when the gods laboured like humans, and we're still labouring to understand what that means. If this exploration through ancient mysteries stayed with you, a like helps other seekers find these stories. More journeys into forgotten knowledge wait in the playlist. Continue whenever you're ready. Share your thoughts below. I'm curious what resonates, what troubles, what questions remain. Wherever you are in the world, whatever hour marks your rest, sleep deeply. Let the ancient voices fade into the background of your dreams. The clay endures, the questions persist, and somewhere between mythology and science, between skepticism and wonder, the truth awaits those patient enough to keep searching. Good night.